Okay. Hi, everyone. It's Friday, November 20th, 2015 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Higher Ed Special Edition. I'm your host, Erin Supinka, and on today's live broadcast, we're talking about making our college websites more accessible. Many of our institutions have small web teams, and content production management and editing are more than many of these teams can handle. And so it's no secret that our web content managers struggle with making accessibility a priority. We are often reacting to taking steps to student or faculty requests, or worse, the threat of legal action. Instead, we should be making accessibility reviews a standard part of our web design process. Today I'm speaking with two web professionals about universal design, a perspective that can have a meaningful impact on both the user experience and marketing efforts at our institutions. Stephen Fornell is the manager of the web development for Tarrant County College District in Fort Worth, Texas. He comes from a secondary education background where he taught computer science and web design to high school students prior to joining the higher ed world. At TCC, Stephen is a champion for accessibility, making access and empathy the cornerstone of all web development work at the college. I went to high school. I just need to insert real fast. I went to high school, and I don't even think we had web development whatsoever, computer science, when I was in high school. So that's really cool. And continuing on to our next guest. Our second guest today is Kate Brown. Kate is a technology trainer at Illinois Wesleyan University, where she manages the professional development program for staff. She is also a PhD candidate in English Studies at Illinois State University, writing a dissertation on disability and biopolitical technology. She also teaches undergraduate courses in composition, digital rhetoric, and techno-humanities. In case those bios weren't enough, you can see that these two are going to be really great people to talk to about universal design and accessibility. I'm really excited to speak with them, but first I do want to give a shout out to the folks who make today's live broadcast possible. Higher Ed Special Edition is part of Higher Ed Live Network, offering viewers direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Live webcasts allow viewers to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in the industry. All episodes of Higher Ed Live, our Higher Ed Special Edition, are free and accessible in the video archives at higheredlive.com and in podcast form at iTunes. Today's live broadcast is made possible by Omni Update. Colleges and universities are feeling the pressure of doing more with less, which makes tackling web accessibility more challenging. By conceptualizing your institution's website from a universal design perspective, you can make an impact on both a user experience and your marketing efforts. Plus, with a powerful content management system like Omni Update's OU Campus platform, you have tools at your fingertips to check accessibility and correct any potential issues. Take control of your institution's web accessibility and be sure to check out omniupdate.com today. And Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communication firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. In Higher Ed, the degree is the product. Your program pages are some of the most marketing critical on your website. If you're interested in getting M. Stoner's model to building effective program pages and spending some quality time with one of their experts, check out the link we just tweeted to learn more. And finally, I'm so excited to welcome Kate and Stephen to the show. And for those of you following along, please don't hesitate to ask questions using the hashtag HigherEdLive, and I'll do my best to ask the questions as they come in. Okay, so let's get started. First question to you, Stephen. Can you set the stage for us? Why is accessibility important?
Well, it's a human issue. It's about making everything equally available to everyone, all of your constituents, all of your faculty and staff. Everyone should have a level playing field. So it's really just about human understanding and empathy.
Anything to add to that, Kate, before we jump into the next one?
Yeah, being a human issue, and I like the idea of the level playing field, because everyone should start out at the same place with the same tools to access the content, and it's the same for any places in our built environment. Thinking about the web as just another extension of our playing field of the spaces and places that we have on campus. So, yeah.
Yes. I saw a great discussion happening on Facebook the other day, actually, that talked about people with a sense of in real life versus internet life, and the truth of the matter is that's not really a separate entity anymore. Real life is the internet. Internet technology is becoming such an integral part of our real life that you can't really draw that separation anymore. Which I thought was a great discussion point, and so I'm really excited to jump into this because my brain's been just kind of going all about that idea and that process. So for both of you, what are the rules and what is at stake if we don't follow them when it comes to accessibility? Who wants to tackle that one?
I think the most obvious one is the legal ramifications. You know, there's a requirement to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are sections that I'm sure Stephen knows a lot more about and can speak to. But I think that's primarily where accessibility comes in, as a reaction or preventing legal action. So there's that responsibility. But there's also what I'm more concerned with is alienating people from campus. You know, what's at stake is if people can't access your content, then they're not going to have a good experience with your institution, and that's really, you know, that's an important stake, right? We want people to have good impressions and good access and good interactions with our places and spaces.
Definitely agree with that. I think the empathy piece is probably the more important component rather than the legal ramifications. You know, it's marketing for your college too, if you want to think of it that way. It makes good business sense to have all of your material equally available to everyone. Yeah.
When we set it up like that, it's one of those, like, yes, that does make sense. Like, you wouldn't want the library completely inaccessible to students who don't live on campus or something. And that just is such an interesting, I think, argument that people don't always think about. So let's kind of take a little bit of a step back. And so for people that might not be 100% of what accessibility means on the web, can you set up some examples or scenarios that could kind of showcase what an accessibility issue might be and how to fix it?
Well, the obvious one that everybody jumps to right away is, say you have a vision impaired user who can't actually see the content on your website. They still have a need to access that content and have it available to them. And that's probably the one that trips people up first when they're first starting to go through and try to make things accessible. It can be a tricky issue. There's a lot of technologies that people use to access that web content, and you have to really have a pretty good understanding of how to create your web content so that it can be used by those alternative technologies.
And then, Kate, you wrote a great blog for actually Omni Update, and you walked through a couple of scenarios. And can you just kind of tell me a little bit more about them? This one I'm reading quick right now. A faculty member decides to work on a committee project while taking a red-eye flight to a conference. She wakes up, the sleeping passengers around her when the video from the latest football pep rally posted on the admission site begins in an autoplay cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite examples. Some of those I made up. Some of them I have direct experience with. But you know, that's sort of thinking. Part of universal design and accessibility is thinking more broadly beyond screen readers and beyond technologies that impaired users might use to how do everyday people interact with this. And so you have certain situations where having an autoplay video makes your site inaccessible. I noticed that we're all wearing glasses here on this episode, so we already have some kind of, however small, impairment. We have an experience with not being able to see as well as we might like. So thinking of some situations where access isn't limited to impairment but benefits all people. I stayed home with my son while I was doing my PhD work for 18 months, and there were many times when I would have to hold him and try to do something online. And so now I have a mobility issue where I only have one hand to navigate, and I also have the sound, you know, trying to keep him quiet and, you know, those sorts of things. So in part, you can have some direct experience that influences what you believe is accessible or what you issues that you need to address. But it's also thinking about other people. One that doesn't have anything to do with the web are curb cuts in sidewalks. That's or hands-free devices. If you've ever used your hands-free function on your phone, you are benefiting from accessible technologies. So that's always where I start is, how am I already benefiting from this, and how can we apply this to some of the web design?
Yeah, that's a great example. I know we have a content strategist at the university that I work at who for a while actually she works on accessibility all of the time, and she actually had an eye scratch on her cornea, and she worked for a week and interacted with the websites, being able to actually see what she was doing to make them more accessible in her own experiences. And so it was she came back with seeing what they had been doing correctly and things that they could even tweak more to make it more accessible. So what are the principles of a universal design? Who wants to take a stab at that one?
In the list, we've got some great examples and some guidelines, and I don't think there's necessarily a set of solid principles, but more of the definition of universal design, both on the web and in real life, having to do with the materials and procedures and philosophies behind making our places and spaces. And I keep saying places and spaces because, a chair that people use is just as part of our it's just as much of the technology as our computers, I think. At least I'm trying to convince people that that's true. So universal design as a basic concept is considering how you build things to allow the most people to interact with that. So that's the basics. But Stephen, I know you have more specific guidelines.
I didn't hear the end of what you said. I'm sorry.
Oh, I know you have more specific guidelines and some that you work off of when you're.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I work kind of on the development side of our web content, and so I work using the WCAG 2.0 guidelines. That's kind of our blueprint for accessibility success with our website. It's, I think, probably the most widely followed standard. It's the closest thing to an official standard there is. And basically it outlines kind of like, it outlines 4 principles. And it's easy to remember. There's an acronym. It's POUR, P-O-U-R. And it's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And within those guidelines, they kind of break it down into more specific things. I don't know how deep you want to get into the nitty-gritty details, but it's out there and easy to find online. So,
can you walk us through just really quickly what POUR stands for and kind of just a couple examples of each?
Yeah, absolutely. The first principle is perceivable, and it has to do with the ability to actually consume that content in whatever form it's in. So this covers kind of the most common web topics, actually. It's having text alternatives for image-based media, or video-based media, or audio-based media. It's having alternatives to time-based media. So, for example, think of like a streaming video clip. You need to have fallbacks for that for people that can't consume that video content, where they can perhaps read a transcript or something like that nature. It's having the ability to have your content adapt to different devices and different layouts that would be simpler for someone to consume. So having the ability to get that content on a variety of different devices kind of goes hand in hand with the responsive web design trend too, because if you're building your site responsively, it tends to work well in all manner of different assistive devices too. And then distinguishability. This one kind of goes back to the visual stuff again, but it's having good contrast in your content so that you can differentiate content from the stuff around it that's not really related to the content. Having good, crisp, clear text that you can read and good colors. The second principle, operable, is being able to work the content in whatever form it's in. So, if, for example, we all have probably different learning management systems that our universities use for course content, and those need to be carefully built and designed so that they can be operated by any user with whatever tools and devices they need. There's a lot of alternatives to a mouse and keyboard when you're working with web content, so it needs to work with whatever their method is of accessing and operating that web page. You also need to, within this principle, consider things like seizures. Actually, is one that pops up that's kind of interesting, I think, to a lot of people when they first see it in the guidelines. But if you have a flickering screen, you could actually trigger a photosensitive seizure in someone, and so you have to make sure you don't have that kind of scenario going on your web page. Something that you probably would never think of normally if you weren't looking at these guidelines. Navigability of your site falls under this operable principle too, so it's being able to get around in the content and be able to move from one piece of content to another at the pace and manner that makes sense to the user, not being forced into, say, like, paging through an awful carousel one at a time to get to the piece of information you need, things like that. The third principle is understandable, and that's just making sure that your content is readable and predictable, and if there's input involved from the user, then they need to be able to get that input in the way that they do that. And then the fourth principle is actually robust, and it just means that your content needs to stay compatible with the ever-changing landscape of assistive technology and web technology.
So those principles make a lot of sense. And so what happens, are there any cases you can tell us or examples that you can show us of what happens when you don't kind of work on making your site accessible and using universal design to make it accessible for all students or all people that are attempting to reach your information? I'm looking at a presentation that you did, and it mentions a couple of schools that I'm assuming didn't follow or didn't adhere to some guidelines that were in place. What are you looking at when you don't adhere to these standards?
Oh, okay. Well, there's a couple real notable examples. Penn State in 2012 ran into an issue where they were, I'm going to read this off the screen here because I don't want to mess up the details, but they were sued by the, is it the National Federation for the Blind? Is that right? And their course management software and their library catalog and even the website for the Office of Disability Services was not consumable to people that needed a screen reader technology. And so that suit was successful, and the school had to pay out a monetary penalty to the people that brought the suit, but also they had to go through and do a complete overhaul of all of their web content and make it accessible, which is a very large undertaking when you're starting from the point of it being completely inaccessible with these legacy systems. So it's a tremendous burden to have to catch it all up when you didn't do it right in the first place.
So for the people that are watching that are kind of are starting to get involved and making sure that their stuff is accessible, what are ways that you can get started? What are some tools or tricks that you can really start making sure that your stuff is accessible? Are there sites out there or apps that we could use to make sure that our website is viewable by someone that might have some sort of vision impairment? What are some tricks that you two could offer up as ways to check the site's accessibility?
Well, I would say start with you. Start where you are, and use what you have. So, for example, I work on a Mac. I'm not sure about PC these days, but Apple has some voiceover dictation software that's already built in. And your keyboard, that would be a great way to test the accessibility of your site by trying to navigate your site just using the keyboard. And then maybe using some of the built-in software to navigate through the pages and have the content read back to you from the speech-to-text, text-to-speech software that you have. What are your experiences with the website? Is there something that is hard for you to get to? Does it take too many clicks? Is it hard to see? It's okay to start with you. I think that's one of the things when I talk to folks about making these changes. They say, well, I don't know. I don't want to presume that I know how other people interact with the site, but you don't have to, especially in those initial stages. And then as you start learning more about the guidelines and the legal requirements, and working with your developers, I know Steven's the nuts and bolts guy. I'm not a developer, so when I look at some of those checklists that are online for accessibility, I don't even know what that means. That's okay. You'll keep learning and you'll keep going. It's all right. I actually have a color contrast picker installed in my my browser as a browser extension, so that when I'm on a site, I can just pick and just do a little bit of testing as I'm thinking about it. So there are definitely tools that aren't that don't take a developer's knowledge to use and start making some of these review moves.
Actually, for people that are on the OU campus content management system, as an example, they have a built-in accessibility checker that works very well, and it's for the end user, the content creators, to use before they publish. And it does a pretty good job of going through and catching all of the most common issues and flagging them for you, just as a quick first step. When you're getting to the kind of the development side and you're working on building out a site, not just the content, but the whole structure of everything, there are tools that can help that process too. The Chrome browser has in its store extensions now that you can get that can do accessibility checks on pages, and that's very, very helpful. There's one that runs very thorough through pretty much everything that can be automated. On the other hand, there's a lot of things that you can't automate it test for. It requires a person to be looking at it and working with it, and so that's part of the process too. You have to get in there and engage with that content in a variety of ways and just test it yourself.
I think it's important to stress the process. The process. This is not a we're going to make all our sites accessible today. This is something that's going to take a lot of input from a lot of different people, lots of different tools, learning time, and maybe if you find that your sites are somewhat inaccessible now, that just means it's a good place to get started. It doesn't have to be an overnight change. You can start with the most common or the most egregious accessibility issue first, and then going through the process of changing all the content or starting building out any new sites with what you've learned.
Definitely agree with that. Sorry.
Nope, go ahead. Those are, again, that's a great place to start. I guess my next question is how do you suggest people kind of start making sure this is being done, or how do they get buy-in to put the time and the resources into these processes and making sure that this is something that people are thinking about? Because if a person's site hasn't been accessible or that hasn't been a thought process, as you guys have mentioned, it can be extremely terrifying to look back and see, wow, all of this content is potentially not accessible. What's a way to get buy-in from your supervisors or from people on your staff to kind of really take a look at this and see that it is something that we really need to focus our energy and time on?
I kind of use a two-pronged approach based on my constituent groups on campus, because not everyone is going to be swayed by the empathy pitch. As you said in the beginning, Erin, we're trying to do more with less, and to say, in addition to all these things we've been doing regularly, we're also going to take this on for fun. I don't know, that's not going to work with some people. So I think the first, prong of this is we could get sued. That's a reason for doing it. And then the other side is getting buy-in from users and content managers. I start every one of my training sessions with some basic universal design principles. So if I'm often training new OU users who are taking over. And so my first thing is look at your site, experience your site, what is happening there. And then as I go through each step, then I bring in the empathetic pitch. People, and pitch makes it sound like I'm trying to sell them something, but it kind of is. It's the buy-in. It's the why does this matter if we're not reacting to problems that have already come up. I explain things about alt text and even some of those scenarios about, what could happen or why it's important to do this. And I think starting with the people who interact with sites the most has really helped us cultivate a culture of accessibility on the web. So.
Anything to add?
Yeah, definitely. You are right on the same page as me. You have to kind of build a coalition of the willing around you and get people bought in and kind of evangelizing about accessibility in your institution. We don't have any accessibility dedicated people, and so our web communications department has kind of become the de facto accessibility experts for our college system, which isn't a job that we wanted to take on, but someone needed to be doing it, and so you step up and you do what's right, and it's just a process of getting people to see that need and why it's important, and just continue to get it out there. We've started doing trainings at our different professional development seminars we do throughout the year, and our department's out there teaching people how to make accessible PDFs and how to send in an Outlook email that's not just an image with no readable text in it, and things that have really nothing to do with the scope of our department really, but someone's got to do it, and so that's what you have to do. You have to build the culture.
Yeah, definitely. I think too, to take this on, if you're out there, person who might be thinking of taking this on, it might require a little bit of stepping out of the comfort zone, to say to someone, let's think about doing this differently, or I'd like to add a transcript to this video, or I'd like to and that can be scary depending on your situation and the politics of your institution, but it doesn't have to be, we're going to change this because accessibility. It could be, I think maybe we could add this. I think this would enhance, and that's where it comes from a marketing standpoint. I was thinking about transcripts on videos. If you have the transcript, that transcript then becomes content that's searchable on your site. So, it's not just about accessibility, but it's also that marketing side.
No, I mean, who doesn't want their content to be in front of more eyeballs and more in front of more minds and potential students or potential faculty, or it's such a, I think, cross-campus decision to be really thinking about accessibility and making sure that whoever visits your website for whatever reason can get exactly where they need to be going without it being a headache or a nightmare. Before I do want to ask a couple of nitty-gritty questions back on the poor subject and kind of breaking down some of those principles and what things we can do to help make an image more accessible. But I just want to remind, if our viewers are watching, if you have any questions to ask these two experts, please feel free to tweet using Higher Ed Live. So I want to step back to the poor example that we were talking about earlier, Stephen. And so the first one, this was actually something that I learned really quickly, because I see things in design and I see images with beautiful bold text and I'm like, oh, that's beautiful. Why can't we do tons of these great cover images with just what we want it to say right there and call it a day? And so I saw text alternatives as one of the principal things, and I was wondering, could you walk through a couple of those things, like with the alternative text tags? What things can we be doing on the back end that allows us to still be a pretty design using those gorgeous images, but still is accessible?
Definitely. Well, the most important thing, if you have image content, that is part of the content, not decorative images, then it must have alternative text provided. That is actually a requirement in the HTML specification. It's an attribute that's added to the image tag, and you just describe the image. People get a little confused about what's supposed to be in that alt attribute sometimes, though, and so you see a lot of really bad alt text out there. Things where like the alt text is literally just like the file name of the image, or it's the word logo 15 different places on the page, and that's not helping anyone understand what that content is. I like to try to explain it to people is, imagine if your best friend suddenly couldn't see today and he needed you to tell him what that picture was. What would you say to him? That's what goes in the alternate text attribute. It needs to describe the image fully. So in particular, we talked about having text on the image. Hopefully we're not doing that as much anymore. I know that was kind of big years ago, but yeah, if you're doing that, then the alternative text needs to include all of the words that are in that image content, for sure. Otherwise, there's no way for it to be read by an assistive device.
Yeah, it's something. Oh, I was going to say that I do see the text on images going away, but it is interesting to see how much it still is prevalent, and people just send me an image and say, this is what I want, put it up, we don't need any text because it says it all on the image. It's like, yeah. No, it doesn't work that way. But
we have kind of an institutional problem with that at our school with the Outlook emails that get sent out by the heads of departments and whatnot. They tend to just be an image, and there's no text in the email at all, and that makes it completely inaccessible. And we have employees that work here that use screen readers. There's a pretty good handful of them actually, and they hate that because they can't read that email. It's completely and totally inaccessible to them. The screen reader literally says no content when they try to have it read to them. So.
And that is very frustrating. I have learned a ton from you guys. I don't have any further questions. Is there anything else that you two really want to get across in our last couple of minutes here about accessibility, universal design, and how to really bring it to university and making sure that your university is up to speed and compliant to all of the different requirements? All right. You know.
Do you want to go first, Kate?
Oh, sure. Universal design is great, and it's a wonderful set of principles to think about when designing sites and revamping some sites you already have. But I think Stephen made a great point by saying that there are users at his institution who use screen readers. The saying that universal design is for everyone, super great. But there are actual technologies and consequences and people who have a stake in making sure that this is accessible, and it's important to remember that however great the principles of universal design are, it's not used to minimize the material realities of people and technologies that are assistive. And I like to encourage everyone to avoid the trap, perhaps, of finding those users and saying, oh, you're the expert on disability, or you're the expert on vision loss or hearing impairment, so can you test our site? Those folks may be useful. I know Stephen's presentation had a great example of how users helped with their design and giving input, but remember that it does affect everyone, but not everyone equally. So choose the folks who work on your site not based on their disability, but their potential for empathy.
I like that a lot. I completely agree. I think the most powerful thing we did was go out and talk to the real users of our site and find out what their needs were. And having that face-to-face interaction with the real people that we're trying to reach was definitely, it was what got us motivated to become champions of this. So.
I think anytime that you can get in front of a person that is actually impacted by what you're doing, it just, for me at least, then when I go and do something later on, I think of those conversations and I think of those people, and it's not just me working on this anymore. I'm thinking of, okay, I met Sally last week and she really struggles with this. And so I think of her, or I think of these different people as I'm working forward. And like you guys mentioned at the beginning, it's about being human and having empathy towards your fellow humans and making sure that everything is fair and accessible. I just want to thank you both so much for joining me. This was great, and I'm going to tweet out the blog that Sarah or Kate that you wrote for Omni Update that has some great more examples that make you think past just the typical, okay, what if I have someone that has some vision impairments or someone that might be deaf or hard of hearing visiting my site. It has other things to get you really thinking about accessibility other than just the typical things we think of. And I want to thank our sponsors, Omni Update and M. Stoner, again, for helping us get the show. And thank you guys for tuning in. I'm Erin Supinka, and I'm signing off. Have a great rest of your day.